if you're paying attention to politics in the United States right now, you might think this is a particularly bleak time, at least my perspective, if you're looking at institutional politics. You know, one of the great democratic theorists in our era is a guy named Sheldon Wolin, and he has recently written a book called Democracy Incorporated. And given the amount of money that's going into institutional politics today, it's a pretty good characterization of our world. And that characterization characterizes institutional politics today, this democratically, or this corporately controlled democratic process, as inverted totalitarianism, where corporations control the government, and they do that by manifesting policies through the forms of militarism, consumerism, and racism. And we all experience those policies. And if that was all you were going to look at in terms of politics, it would seem a pretty bleak world. But the reality is today there's very exciting politics going on at the grassroots level. In fact, I believe that we are at a new zenith with grassroots politics in the United States and around the world that reaches the same kind of zenith that happened in the 1960s, but in a different form. Because what the groups today, like Idle No More in Canada with the Indigenous peoples and the tar sands, or the immigrant justice, migrant worker justice movements, or the prison abolition movements, or Occupy, or the global climate convergence movements, they all are recognizing that there is a convergence of issues, that instead of having separate silos in which we work, that the issues that they are facing are all connected together. And you can't separate those issues, and you can't work on one without beginning to work on another. And in fact, a lot of that work is to suggest where the people who have been most harmed historically are, and how can activists across all levels take up their issues? How can we take up the issues of the unhoused? How can we take up the issues of the indigenous peoples where the tar sands are being ruining their homelands? These are fundamental issues that if we take up those issues at their levels, we'll bring about change for all of us. We have today with us the author of Another Politics, who's looking at these transformative movements at a grassroots level, radical politics, who's gone out and interviewed many of the people who are participating in these movements and come back to talk to us about the lessons that he's learned with the convergence. So today what we're going to do is we're going to have about 45 minutes with Chris Dixon in terms of his talk, and then we'll open it up for questions. So if you have questions, please hold them towards the end, and then we'll give you the opportunity to ask Chris questions directly. With that said, please welcome Chris Dixon.
Thanks, Dan. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So it's really excellent to be here with you. It's really quite a pleasure to be in Eugene. This is day 20 of a 5-week West Coast tour, and this is event number 13. And every single event has been so exciting and stimulating to talk about these issues and also get into some of the conversations about this stuff. So I'm thrilled to be here. And I want to particularly thank Stan for organizing this event and hosting me here and doing all the logistics to make that happen, and to Kim Marks for initially facilitating that. I've heard wonderful things about Lane Community College for many years, and it's nice to finally be present with you in this longhouse. And on that note, I actually want to start by acknowledging that we are on traditional indigenous territory. We're on the land of the Kalapuya people. And I make this acknowledgement not as a formality or as a piece of rhetoric, but actually to point to the fact that we're always living, working, learning, and struggling within an ongoing colonial situation. This is not a historic fact, it's an ongoing reality. And I do this as well to point to ongoing indigenous resistance and resilience across this continent. And hopefully what I say will get into this a little bit more as we go, and perhaps it will come up in our conversation too. So, thanks to Stan for that lovely introduction. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself so you know where I'm coming from with what I'm going to share with you. So, I'm from Anchorage, Alaska, on traditional Dena'ina territory. I grew up there. And I currently live in Ottawa, Ontario, in Canada. It's the national capital of Canada on traditional Algonquin territory. For many years in between, I lived on the US West Coast in Washington, in Oregon, and in California, where I went to graduate school. And I was involved in a variety of social justice struggles all the way down. And then I've been in the Canadian context now for about 7 years. So I have a perspective that's from both sides of that border and from being involved in activist work in both of those national contexts. I'm also a collective member of the Institute for Anarchist Studies, which is an organization that basically gives out money to fund people to write about radical ideas and radical history, particularly people who are not professors. So if you have any friends or you yourself are interested in writing about radical ideas or radical history, come talk to me about it. And the other thing I should say is that I went to graduate school and I got a PhD, but I am a deprofessionalized academic. What that means is that I didn't ever intend to become a professor. I went into the academy to try and use it and use its resources to further the work that I care about within social movements. And part of what I'm doing today is hopefully along those lines, toward those goals. So you don't need to call me doctor or professor, because I'm not. So as Stan mentioned, part of what I've been up to over the last several years is I traveled around the US and Canada and I interviewed dozens and dozens of longtime radical activists and organizers involved in a whole variety of movements. And I love some of the photos that ended up appearing on the front of the book because I think they get into some of the variety of movements that are out there. I talked to people in more than half a dozen cities and I asked questions about what are we learning? What kinds of challenges are we coming up against? What are some of the consistently unresolved questions that we face? And this book was an attempt to try and pull together some of the answers people gave as I spoke with them. And on that note, one important thing I need to say is that this afternoon you will witness a magic trick. And the magic trick is this. You will see my mouth moving. It will seem as if there are ideas coming just out of my brain, but they're not. They're actually coming from dozens, if not hundreds, of activists across this continent who've shared their ideas. So I am not a brilliant person. In this society, we're often taught to look to individual people to be really smart and really brilliant, and I'm not. But I'm very happy to be connected to brilliant movements, and that's part of what I want to try and share with you. The other thing is, as is my practice, I like to dedicate any time I give a public presentation to a particular organization that I've learned from, that has really influenced my thinking. And today I would like to dedicate this talk to the Seattle Solidarity Network, which is an organization in Seattle that uses direct action organizing to actually confront bosses and landlords when they do things like not pay their employees or try to evict people unjustly. You can find out more about Seattle Solidarity Network by Googling them. And there's many other solidarity networks in other cities that are trying to take some of their methods and run with them. Okay, so in my presentation today, I'm going to talk about a political tendency, a radical political current that I think is playing an increasingly influential role across a range of social movements in the US and Canada right now. We can see it on the radical edge of the Occupy movement, of the climate justice movement. We can see it as connected to Idle No More, which is the upsurge of Indigenous activism that's happened in Canada over the last couple of years. We can see it in the movement against the prison industrial complex, and many other movements as well. For shorthand, I'm going to call this political tendency that I'm going to be talking about the anti-authoritarian current. It's a political current that is a part of a broader set of movements. And just to get us on the same page, I'll offer a brief definition right now of what I'm talking about when I talk about the anti-authoritarian current. This current combines two things, and I'll get more into this as we go, but I wanted to make sure that we start off with a basic understanding of what I'm talking about. The two things it combines are a commitment to struggling against multiple forms of oppression, multiple power relations as they work in this society, including having a critical orientation toward the state. And the second thing is a commitment to grassroots organizing among people who aren't self-identified activists. So actually trying to move and connect with people beyond little activist subcultures and activist scenes and build broader movements in various ways. So this is what I'm basically talking about when I speak about the anti-authoritarian current. And as I said, I'll get more into it. I think over the last couple of decades that activists and organizers within this political tendency have been really busy building networks, campaigns, and organizations of various kinds that reflect this kind of double commitment here. And we can see examples of this. They include the No One is Illegal network across Canada, which I'll describe a little bit more later. They include the Rising Tide North America network, which includes more than 60 local groups at this point involved in climate justice activity. They include national organizations in the United States, like Critical Resistance and Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, both of which I'll talk some more about. And they also are connected to networks around activist publications of various sorts, like Makeshift Magazine out of Los Angeles or Up in the Ante out of Toronto. So the point is that those of us in this current, and I'll say us and we because I am part of this political tendency, those of us in this political current are bringing our commitments and our ideas into a whole variety of activist work and organizing work, including stuff around anti-poverty, racial justice, radical queer networks, anti-war activity, pushing back against austerity agendas, various things. So what I intend to do today is try to give you a sense of this emerging politics. And I think it's really influential, and I'm going to argue that it's influential. And I'm also going to argue that this current is really innovatively pulling together some long-standing radical histories. It's cohering a set of kind of shared politics and practices, and that it has some important lessons to offer, I think, a wide variety of efforts. And so I'm a linear thinker, and that means that I like to tell you exactly what I'm going to do. Those are the three things I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about 3 historical strands. I'm going to talk about 4 principles that I think are at the core of this politics. And then I'm going to turn to some lessons for movement building that I think have broad relevance. Does it make sense as a plan? Okay. That's what you can expect. So I'm trained as a social movement historian. That's basically what I did when I went to graduate school. And part of that training means that whenever I look at any political phenomenon in the world, the first question I ask is, where did it come from? What are its origins? So that's where I'm going to start in what I have to say today. The anti-authoritarian current that I'm talking about has connections to a very long lineage of social movements and struggles of various kinds that I think go back to early fights against the colonization of the Americas, as well as the movement to abolish slavery. It also has some roots in the development of socialist politics in the late 19th century. But I do think there's something new here, and that's more what I'm going to focus on today. I think particularly over the last few decades, a variety of radical politics and broader movements have converged and have kind of intermingled in ways that are producing something that's really quite interesting and exciting. And right now what I want to do is highlight 3 political strands, 3 strands of activism that I think have been particularly important in this convergence of ideas and movements. And all of these strands have their origins in the 1970s. So the first is women of color feminism. How many people have heard this term before, women of color feminism? Okay. So to the extent that you have heard this term, That's because radical women of color feminists fought for space in universities to spread and develop these ideas. That's why you know what that term means. And to give some background, this is a political strand that's rooted in earlier movement experiences, but really bloomed in the liberation movements associated with that era known as the 1960s. Really, women of color feminism came into its own in the 1970s and 1980s. And this politics took a lot of different routes, but one common starting point was radical women of color in the 1970s looking around at all the existing social movements and saying none of these movements can fully account for the ways in which we are simultaneously experiencing forms of oppression from multiple angles, based on race, gender, class, and often sexuality, because many of these activists were lesbians. These folks started coming together in the 70s through collectives, through radical publications, and through social scenes. And they began developing a politics in common that we now associate with radical women of color feminism. And one of the earliest articulations of these politics was in 1977. One of the earliest written articulations of these politics was in 1977 in Boston by a collective of black feminists that called themselves the Combahee River Collective. So you may have encountered this statement called the Combahee River Collective Statement, or you may someday encounter this statement. It's really worth reading and reading carefully. And I want to just go over one sentence that I think is particularly crucial from this statement. So in 1977, this black feminist collective wrote, "We are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking." So they were actually putting together what they called an integrated analysis. And the idea of an integrated analysis was to take all these separate kinds of issues and ways that people are affected by broader systems and power relations in society and by institutions. And they were saying the way that women of color experience these things from all these different angles simultaneously illuminates these systems and these institutions, not just in the lives of women of color, but actually in all of our lives, because we're all located within this system. We all have relationships within this system, and some of us have benefit from some of these systems too. And this politics also, at the same time, called for a kind of revolutionary approach that was based on a multi-layered fight against all of these systems simultaneously. So these ideas have developed a lot over the last 3 decades. Sometimes in universities, people talk about them as intersectionality. That's a concept that's gotten connected to this stuff. An important organization that has helped develop these ideas is Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, which started out in the year 2000 and has played a very important role in having multiple local chapters and in actually bridging university-based thinkers and people who are engaged in various kinds of grassroots organizing. And they've developed a political approach that tries to pull together an integrated analysis with a critical understanding of capitalism and also a very critical take on the state, especially state violence directed at women of color. In this political strand, people have also been trying to put these politics into practice. In particular, some organizations associated with Insight have tried to develop new kinds of community organizing methods based in these ideas. So for instance, the organization Sista to Sista, which was based in Brooklyn for many years, was organizing with low-income young women of color in a very particular part of Brooklyn. And they used things like storytelling, like collective leadership development, to try and build organizational capacity and bring people together in new kinds of ways. And then they took action together. For example, they really particularly tried to focus on what's the connection between interpersonal violence, often based on gender, and state violence. And they would sometimes do things like go to the employers of particular men who had engaged in violent acts against their partners and raise a ruckus and say, why have you not been accountable for the ways that you've hurt this person in your life? The other thing I should say about Insight that has been important is that they have popularized an idea called the nonprofit industrial complex. Has anyone heard this term, nonprofit industrial complex? Okay, so this is an Insight idea that came out of a conference that they organized where they brought together a lot of people who were particularly involved in nonprofit organizations within the movement against what is called sometimes domestic violence. And what they started talking about was this experience that so many activists had in these organizations, which is state funding, private philanthropic funding, and non-governmental organizations are often connected through a circuit, a funding circuit, and that circuit can actually constrain what movements do and shape what kinds of priorities organizations take on. And so they talked about the nonprofit industrial complex as a way to say that it sets up limitations for our movements when we're so reliant on these external funders and this particular organizational form of nonprofits. All right, the second strand I wanted to mention is prison abolitionism. Has anyone heard this term, prison abolitionism? Okay, that's better than usual. So this is a politics that really comes out of the long Black freedom struggle in this country, but really in many ways came into its own in the 1970s. A thing to bear in mind is that in the 1970s, there was widespread organizing happening inside prisons. People were actually coming together and figuring out how to try and improve the conditions inside prisons, and they were trying to figure out how to build connections with activists on the outside, too. And sometimes this sparked intense confrontations, like in 1971 in upstate New York at Attica, where there was a major showdown. But these things happen in many places. In Canada in 1976, there was a hunger strike at a maximum security institution called Millhaven that actually spread across prisons in many parts of the country. So this was a moment where people were doing all kinds of organizing inside. And it created the context for a politics, a prison abolitionist politics to develop. And the idea of prison abolitionist politics is people trying to do away with all institutions of incarceration, trying to create a world without prisons. That was the basic idea. In the 1990s, we saw the development of a bigger movement. And let's just think for a moment about the early 1990s. This was after a decade of Ronald Reagan as president with a law and order agenda that basically meant this: a war on drugs, increasingly high rates of imprisonment, particularly targeting communities of color, and a massive level of incarceration in the United States, beyond anything in US history before. Of course, we're at a much bigger level of mass incarceration at this point. But by the early 90s, a lot of people were noticing this thing going on, and they were trying to name it, they were trying to talk about it. This guy, Mike Davis, came up with the idea of prison industrial complex. And that term has become much more popular. Like, it's really spread throughout many activist scenes and across many different organizations. And when people say prison industrial complex, what they mean is the interlocking set of institutions and social relations based on surveillance, policing, and imprisonment. So not just prisons, but actually entire systems and institutions that are based on detaining people, arresting people, putting them through court systems, and criminalizing them in various ways. So in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, people on the radical wing of the movement against the prison industrial complex started coming together first through conferences and then together in an organization called Critical Resistance. And Critical Resistance was taking the legacy of prison abolitionism and actually calling for prison industrial complex abolition. And Critical Resistance has since played a very important role in connecting much of this work together with a kind of renewed abolitionist politics that questions the legitimacy of the state whether it can actually, should be engaged in punishing and policing people. This politics has also connected into a critical understanding of how prisons and other institutions in the criminal justice system are connected to how race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, citizenship, how all these things work in our society. Abolitionists have tried to put their politics into practice in a lot of different ways, but I'm going to mention just two. One is that folks in critical resistance have tried to struggle and build campaigns based not on trying to reform prisons, not trying to make them better, but actually trying to do away with them altogether. There's actually a very long history of prison reform movements in this country that have just built more prisons in an effort to make them better. They do this practically by using community-based campaigns to fight prison construction, and also by setting up programs to help people get out of prison and stay out of prison. The other thing is that some abolitionists, in collaboration often with women of color feminists, have started to experiment with ways to deal with conflict, harm, and violence as they happen in communities without resorting to the state, without calling the cops. And one practical example of this is the experiment that happened in New York for a number of years called the harm-free zone. And this was a set of organizers in a heavily policed community of color in New York trying to figure out how to build some new institutions there, some new community institutions that people could turn to when they were experiencing violence, when there was harm of various kinds happening or conflict, and using these institutions rather than calling 911. Because what they had seen over and over again in these situations was that calling 911 often made things much worse in their community. It often meant that somebody went to jail, and occasionally it meant that someone got killed. I think those are really useful and interesting experiments, but I don't want to pretend that they're perfect or that they figured everything out. In fact, the harm-free zone folks, that whole thing fell apart eventually. But I do think there are other kinds of experiments like this, and they're provocative. All right, the last strand I want to talk about is anarchism. Have people heard this term anarchism before? Okay. So historically, anarchism has its origins in working class anti-capitalist movements at the end of the 19th century. At that point, it was a political tradition that was opposed to capitalism, landlordism, and the state, and called for building a new society that was based on social equality, on mutual aid, on people being able to actually manage and run the institutions that rule our lives. I'm not going to bore you by going on a long lecture about the history of classical anarchism, because I promise you that would put you to sleep. Instead, I want to fast forward into the 20th century and say that in the mid-20th century, particularly as part of the movements of the 1960s and the counterculture that came out of the 1960s, anarchism began to change. It began to change into something that is more recognizable in terms of what we understand anarchism to be today. And starting in the 1970s especially, there was a chain of movement experiences that really pulled together many of the ideas and the ways of doing things that are now very common within anarchist politics and anarchist activism. Just want to mention the links in this chain briefly without going into them in great detail. The first was the direct action nonviolent movement, nonviolent direct action movement. Often this is referred to as the anti-nuke movement of the 1970s and 1980s. People were engaging in large-scale civil disobedience to fight nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And they were figuring out new models for how to come together and do this. The second link in this chain was direct action AIDS activism in the 1980s and 1990s, often associated with the group ACT UP that had chapters throughout the United States in many large cities. In the Canadian context, the group that was more prominent was AIDS Action Now. So these were folks that were fighting in a situation where governments actually refused to even say the word AIDS in the midst of a major health epidemic. And they were fighting to actually get access to research funds, to money for experimental medications, and to set up new kinds of practices of care in this really, really scary moment. The third link in this chain, which has a special place here in the Northwest, is forest defense activism, especially over the 1990s, but definitely starting earlier in the 80s and continuing in many ways into the present. Forest defense activism is especially identified with Earth First. These were folks who were going into the woods and setting up tree sits, setting up blockades to basically try and save the last of old-growth forests and other kinds of wilderness areas. And these folks were facing intense numbers of arrests, all kinds of police repression, and they were building very, very close communities to try and do this work together. They figured out lots of new ideas for engaging in direct action and for building close democratic forms of organization together. The last link of this chain, which in many ways came out of some of that forest defense stuff, was the global justice movement. So this is sometimes called the anti-globalization movement. Have people heard of the anti-globalization movement? Okay, so this, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, was a movement where people were doing a lot of protests at summits of international financial institutions, like the International Monetary Fund or the Organization of American States. The most famous protest, probably within the US context, is the Seattle 1999 protest against the World Trade Organization ministerial, where people actually managed to use such effective forms of direct action that they delayed the start of the ministerial and contributed to it falling apart over the course of the next few days. So this chain of movements, there's lots to say about it, but the main thing that I want to get across to you is that this chain of movements pulled together a few key things, a few key ideas and practices that I think have become very consistent among a lot of radical activists and have definitely become consistent within anarchist politics. The first one is a commitment to large-scale forms of direct action, often civil disobedience, but confrontational activity that is disruptive and that is large-scale. The second thing is forms of deeply democratic coordination, often among smaller groups of activists, sometimes called affinity groups, and frequently using a form of decision-making called consensus that's different than majority rule, but is instead based on trying to build full agreement among people about moving forward together. And the last thing that's kind of become wielded together through this chain of experiences is a focus on developing new ways of relating with each other and building new kinds of institutions. So things like housing co-ops, food co-ops, new forms of caring for one another, or ways of trying to deal with how power relations emerge within activist groups and figure out how to wrestle with that through things like anti-oppression trainings. So in the early 2000s, this movement, the global justice movement, was waning, particularly after September 11th, but also based on some of its own internal problems. The movement was starting to go down. But people who'd been politicized through that experience, who had connected with these ideas and practices, were trying to take them and figure out where to go with them and use them in more effective ways. This was sometimes called a turn to the local, because people were trying to figure out how to move into their communities and do effective work there. And I think there was a lot of sophistication that came out of that. And one important example is the network of No One is Illegal collectives across the Canadian context. Have people heard of No One is Illegal? Okay, that's more than I expected. So in most major Canadian cities, there are these collectives called No One is Illegal. And what they do is they organize to fight against deportations of individuals and families, and they do that in conjunction with broader migrant communities. They try to actually build the power of migrant communities to fight back against deportations and to fight back against immigration authorities. They do this at the same time as they build relationships with indigenous communities defending their traditional territories. So they actually tried to build connections between migrant communities, often in more city-based contexts, and indigenous communities in more rural areas. And they do this with a broad understanding of capitalism and colonialism and how it affects people, how it creates a container for where all this stuff plays out. I think No One is Illegal is a really good example of people coming out of the global justice movement who tried to figure out a more radical and relevant way to put their politics to use. There were a bunch of anarchists. They were involved in summit protests. 9/11 happened. In Canada, they were like, what should we do? Let's talk about borders and immigration, especially in a moment where racism is really on the rise as these governments start to talk about, going abroad and bombing all kinds of people. I think another and maybe even more contemporary example of this is climate justice organizing, and particularly the network of groups affiliated with Rising Tide. Again, these are many people who I think have gone through this chain of movement experiences and are trying to take these practices into confronting this climate catastrophe, right? Because we actually are in the midst of a climate catastrophe. It's not like a thing that is going to happen in the future. Things are already changing dramatically around us. And people are starting to think about how to organize in the face of this, and particularly to confront resource extraction and resource transportation. So whether we're talking about the tar sands in Alberta or we're talking about coal trains through the Northwest, people are starting to focus on using direct action methods to shut this stuff down, to blockade it as a way to prevent further deepening of the climate catastrophe that we're in. So I think Rising Tide is another example of this kind of blossoming of some of these politics. There's many other examples to mention, but I'm not going to bore you with too many details. The main other thing I just wanted to say is that anarchism had an important role within the Occupy movement. How many people here had some connection with Occupy? Okay. So these ideas around trying to build general assemblies, to set up encampments that manifest our values in various ways, and to use some forms of direct action, these were all parts of Occupy. I think that we can expect that these kinds of anarchist ideas are going to continue to pop up again and again as more upsurges happen in the future. Okay, so there's a growing interconnectedness among these political strands and other political strands too that I don't have time to go into right now. And I think this interconnectedness is starting to create the basis for some kind of shared politics within the anti-authoritarian current. And I want to turn to these politics now very briefly. The first thing I should say is that there's no consensus on what to call these shared politics. There's no term that everybody agrees on. Some people use terms like horizontalist or autonomous. Some people say radical. A lot of people predictably don't want any political labels altogether. So I use the term another politics as a kind of placeholder to talk about what I see as these emerging shared ideas and practices that people are developing together. And this formulation, another politics, came into wider use based on the work of a collective in New York called the Another Politics as Possible Collective that took a delegation of hundreds of people to the US Social Forum in 2007 in Atlanta. And they, of course, were drawing on some vocabulary from revolutionaries in the Mexican context, the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, who've played a very influential role for this political current. And the Zapatistas talk about their other campaign and other politics. So I like this term, but I'm not trying to trademark it. I am just trying to create a sort of placeholder. I like this term because I think it gestures poetically to something that is in process and unfinished, something that consciously pushes beyond available categories, like what we currently have with us right now, and something that can be shared, that people could have in common together. So there's no party line. There's no central committee that decides what these politics are. But there are some principles that I think are fairly consistent that really resonated among lots of people I spoke with. I want to talk about these four, each just a little bit. The first one is struggling against multiple forms of oppression. And this is, of course, connected to that women of color feminist politics. This is often also associated with this idea of anti-oppression politics. And I think it's the kind of no in this political current. I think it's the kind of pushback of saying this is what we do not want. And it means developing approaches and analyses to really challenge and transform a whole bunch of different systems of how things happen in this society, whether we're talking about capitalism, whether we're talking about patriarchal gender relations, whether we're talking about forms of racial domination, whether we're talking about long legacies of colonialism, whether we're talking about ability and disability, whether we're talking about citizenship, and whether we're talking about heterosexism and the way that it organizes what kinds of sexualities are okay to happen. In concrete terms, I think this principle means trying to center struggles and perspectives of people who are facing the brunt of these systems. And I think it also entails what a migrant justice organizer in Montreal, Sarita Ahuja, called reorganizing ourselves socially. So actually working through activist groups to try and change how we interact with one another through political education and also struggle with one another to try and shift how we act and how we think. The second principle is about developing new ways of relating and also new kinds of institutions and organizations. This is sometimes called prefigurative politics, which is a fancy word that basically means trying to manifest through how we're doing what we're doing our vision of a different society, our values for what a better society could look like. I think this is the affirmative part of another politics. This is the yes. This is the constructive attempt to build something else. And it's about trying to manifest and build, really to the greatest extent possible, the egalitarian and deeply democratic world in how we organize right now, in what we're doing. And this principle informs the kinds of organizations we build, the kinds of organizing methods we favor, and also the kinds of relationships that we build with one another while we're engaged in activist work. It also frames, as a prison abolitionist organizer in Toronto said to me, Marika Werner, the way that we interact, the way that we try to be aware of what is going on for people, and really try to make room for people to show up whole at the table. So actually creating movements and activist groups where people can bring their whole selves with all the complexities and hardships that are there and all of the complications, and not asking people to actually leave parts of themselves at the door when they get involved. The third principle is about strategy. It's about linking fights around the lives of ordinary people to longer-term radical vision of what a different world could be. And I think the consistent question here is the one that was posed to me by an HIV, AIDS, and housing organizer in New York City named Michelle O'Brien. Michelle asked, what's the relationship between concrete activities and vision? What's the relationship between concrete activities and vision? Between what we're doing right now and how we're doing activist work and what we ultimately want to achieve. And I think in general terms, we forge that connection through fighting in this world as it currently is. And sometimes that means fighting to defend things and fighting for reforms that improve people's lives and prevent more destruction from happening. But always doing this in a way that's connected to a possibility of something bigger and better, a much bigger and more transformative idea of how the society could be. This kind of vision-based work also, I think, includes building counter-institutions. Institutions that actually try to meet people's needs, and there are many needs in the society, including food, shelter, play, security, right? Like there's lots of things that people need. And I think we do need to actually have institutions that can provide those things while also being connected to movements that are trying to challenge the inequities and violence that go on a structural level in this society. Okay, so the last principle I want to talk about is in some ways the most important. It's about organizing, grassroots bottom-up organizing. And I think it's important partly because there's a tendency right now among many people involved in activist politics to feel like any kind of political activity is organizing. So sometimes people think that posting your opinion on Facebook is organizing. No, it's not. That's not organizing. That's a form of dissidence. It can be a form of putting out a critical perspective, but that's not actually organizing. I really began to think more deeply about organizing in conversation with a criminal justice reform organizer in New Orleans named Rossana Cruz. And I asked her, what is organizing, Rossana? How do you think about what you're doing? And the definition she gave me was useful. She said, organizing is bringing people together in ways that link them in a long-term struggle and build their power. Linking people together in a longer-term struggle and build enough power that we can actually push back against the people who make rules and policies in our society. And that, I think, is a very useful definition of organizing because it's about building. It's about building more and more. This involves creating relationships with people and working with them in a whole variety of circumstances. Workplaces, campuses, communities, all the other ways that people congregate in this society. Working with people to bring them together and try and confront and change institutions and social relations as they're happening. Now, alongside this, I should say, there are many kinds of organizing. And there's some kinds of organizing that are very top-down, where there's a small group of people who are basically directing how many other people are supposed to act. And I think part of what's important in another politics is this kind of priority on organizing that is bottom-up, that tries to involve as many people as possible in making decisions together about how to move forward in what we're doing. And we can see that in things like a commitment to using very deeply democratic decision-making practices, in trying to train people to have more confidence and capability to take on more responsibilities and feel able to take up and take initiative. And also in forms of participatory political education, where it's about how do we train more and more of us so that we have critical analysis to understand how the society works. And we carry this out through a bunch of different organizational forms, including democratic membership organizations, collectives linked to broader movements, general assemblies, and so on. There's lots of experiments going on that I think are really promising. So there's a lot more to say about all these politics. One thing is that much of this is often more aspiration than reality. It's more what people hope to have in our movements than what we've actually fully figured out and made possible in some way. So I want to be real about that I'm not trying to say that somewhere out there someone's got this all figured out and they're making it happen, because that's not the case. But I do think, nevertheless, that people are doing organizing work on the ground every day. And we're figuring out some important things. We're learning some lessons. And I think that some of the lessons that come out of this political current are useful not just for people who are into these politics, but actually for anyone who's interested in trying to change society. And so the last part of what I'm going to say is based on 3 lessons that come out of these conversations. These are 3 lessons about movement building. And I use exclamation marks because I think they're really important. They're really important lessons. So the first one is about how we treat one another. I think one thing that most of us in this society learn really well is how to treat one another with contempt, rivalry, objectification, competition, and exclusion. We learn how to treat one another like shit in this society. It's like one of the things that it teaches us how to do very, very well. At their high points, movements sometimes create situations where we can realize other ways of treating people that are based on other values, like generosity, respect, openness, collaboration, and so on. But much of the time within social movements and activist groups, I have to say, people don't actually do that much better at treating one another than they do in the rest of society. There's still a lot of treating people like shit that happens. And sadly, I don't think there's a way to make that change instantaneously. This way of learning how to treat one another is deeply ingrained in how the society works, in how power works in this whole social structure. And it can't simply be wished away. But I still think we have a responsibility to reach toward other ways of being and acting with one another. And part of how I came to think about this was based on my conversation with Helen Hudson, an anti-prison organizer in Montreal. Helen said to me, struggle can be a really humanizing experience. Struggle can be a really humanizing experience. And the way I understood this was that she was saying that when people come together to fight collectively, we can actually realize our own humanity and the humanity of other people in very profound ways. I believe we can and should build movements where we can experience our best selves and the best selves of other people. The second lesson is about experimentation. There's a tendency many times within movements and activist groups to take one particular way of doing things, whether it's a particular kind of tactic of disruption, or a particular way of making decisions, or a particular way of trying to fight oppression, or a particular way of organizing in our groups. To take one thing and just do it over and over and over again, without thinking critically about why, or whether it's even working for us. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's a dead end. I think we need to be able to think and act much more dynamically. And for this, we can turn to a formulation that became more popular within the global justice movement. And the idea there was, that people sometimes spoke about, was to understand movements as laboratories of resistance. I really like this phrase, laboratories of resistance. David Solnit, a longtime direct action organizer in San Francisco, wrote about this idea of laboratories of resistance at one point. He said, when we shift our thinking to see our organizing and actions as a laboratory, then we can see our actions as experiments. In keeping with this spirit, much of the value of the experiment is in the evaluation and discussion of what we learned. So the idea here is actually something that probably, unfortunately, you learned in high school chemistry class. An experiment is where we try to do something. Sometimes we succeed at what we're doing. Sometimes we fail at what we're doing. Usually we do a little bit of both. We have a little bit of success and a little bit of failure. And then we say, what happened? What can we learn from this? What can we do different next time? How can we change what we're doing to make it more successful the next time around? And I think this kind of experimental approach is much more useful. It's instead of trying to figure out what are the perfect forms and just repeating them over and over again, we can just actually try things and understand that they're never going to be fully perfect, but that instead we're going to be involved in a kind of ongoing creative process. I think that's what successful social movements do. All right, the last lesson is the most abstract thing I'm going to say today. And it's about linking up what I refer to as the against and beyond. These are terms I take from a radical theorist named John Holloway. In my understanding, the against is work within social movements to push back, to resist, to protest. Often this involves very specific kinds of protest activities against ruling institutions, against the government, or against corporations, and so on. The beyond is our work of trying to create alternatives, to build new kinds of organizations and institutions. Prison industrial complex abolitionists sometimes use terms for this of dismantling and building. They say that we got to dismantle and build at the same time. And I think that's also a very helpful way to think about it. And my basic idea here is that we should try and do both of these things together, that we should keep a link between these two kinds of activity, because there's often a tendency for them to be separated, and for people who are engaged in against kinds of activity to see the people who are engaged in the beyond and the kind of constructive alternative building as totally out to lunch, as just kind of fantastical utopians who have no sense of what it's going to take to try and change things. And there's also a tendency for people who are involved in the kind of alternative building, the beyond activity, to feel like the protest folks, the against folks, are just too negative and they don't have any vision. But I think we need to hold it together. We need to figure out ways to hold it together. I mean, movements can be as fierce and full of resistance as we can possibly make them. But unless we have alternatives, unless we actually build viable alternatives, we can't actually realize anything different. All we can do is just fight, constantly fight. And on the other hand, the major systems that rule this society have an astounding capacity to actually accommodate and even profit from rebellious subcultures and alternative communities, right? Punk rock is a fantastic example of this. It started out with wonderful rebellious aspirations and is now very much a motor for money-making, right? Like, the music industry has found a great way to capitalize on that and actually to see the kind of rebellion that can be sold through punk rock styles and music as a whole new venture, a whole new arena. So we absolutely need the alternatives and the alternative building, but they're going to get completely co-opted unless they're connected to movements that in some way challenge how power and profit-making works in this society. So I think that when we link these things together, when we link together the against and beyond, we can actually have movements that fight, that really challenge injustice and inequality in this system, while also practically building the new kind of forms that we want, the new sorts of alternatives that we need. All right, I'm just going to wrap up by saying that I think what I've been talking about with Another Politics lies actually not just on this continent, but really around the world, in the efforts of people who are engaged in all kinds of struggles and organizing to figure stuff out, to draw lessons and grapple with challenges. And I think there's a lot that's very promising there. At the same time, I have to say, the stakes are very high right now. My analysis of what's happening, life and life-making on this planet are being undermined on a scale that has never been seen in human history, right? Like, we don't know what's going to happen with global climate catastrophe, with increased militarization and heightened racism, with the kinds of violences that are happening all the time, and the level of misery and destruction that's going along with it all. So I want to be real about that. We're in a really dire moment. But I think we can look always to glimmers of possibility where people come together and create new ways of fighting back and building alternatives. Lately, for me, that's involved places like Hong Kong and also Ferguson, where people have mobilized, I think, in very, very useful ways. So I'm hoping that we can understand the discussion that we're going to have here today as part of an ongoing conversation that I think is happening all over the place right now as we try to figure out what to do in these very, very difficult and scary circumstances. So that's what I got. That's all I have.
So we're going to have an opportunity for questions. So I'll come to you with the mic so that you can ask your questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
Okay, my question is, can you please explain how the No One is Illegal project, is that promoting people to break immigration laws that have been set up in place by a government that is legitimate?
Yes. Yes. So the idea behind No One is Illegal is that there are these borders of nation states, and they are illegitimate, right? That they are actually colonial constructs, and that people should be able to come and go across them, and to actually move toward better lives. And so no one is illegal. Like, it actually is well summed up, like, and very intentionally in the name, no one is illegal, that they're saying, no one's illegal. Like, this idea of illegality is actually, it's not for real. It's a made-up thing, and people should be able to come and go. So yeah, it's exactly that.
Other question?
I just kind of want to follow that up a little bit. I'm just curious about how you went about immigrating to Canada.
Say it again?
I was just kind of curious about your experience immigrating to Canada.
Oh, my immigrant. So it was much easier for me to immigrate to Canada because I'm white, I'm a man, and I have a graduate education, right? So one of the things is that it used to be much, much easier to immigrate to Canada. I had a fascinating conversation, for example, with a person in Bellingham, a longtime activist in Bellingham when I was just up there, who was part of the Underground Railroad sanctuary movement in the 1980s. It was basically helping people from countries like Guatemala engaged in massive civil wars to get into Canada and seek refugee status. And that was an era where Canada actually had much better kinds of regulations around recognizing refugees than the United States. But it's not so rosy of a picture anymore. The ruling government in Canada, the Conservative Party, has basically looked at the US and actually looked at the worst aspects of the US and said, how can we build this in Canada? And whether we're talking about prison construction on a large scale or talking about enormous kinds of clampdowns on borders and immigration. So almost on a daily basis, that government is rolling out new kinds of restrictions on people's ability to seek refugee status and to immigrate into Canada. And so people who don't look like me, who are brown, who don't speak English or French as a first language, who don't come from the United States, face incredible barriers getting into that country. So despite the kind of ways that Canada tries to perpetuate this idea of itself as this kind of ideal society in the North, it's not. It's not.
I'd like to make a statement and then just have you comment on the statement. Mm-hmm. There is no change possible unless there is a balance of power.
Can you say more about what you mean by balance of power?
No. I just wanted your response to that.
So I guess it depends on what you mean by balance of power. I think there's no change possible without power. And I think this is actually one of the challenges of high school civics and government classes in the United States, where we learn that social change in the US mainly happens through advocating to elected officials and making good arguments to try and convince them, and then perhaps voting other people into office to carry out what we would like to see. But the reality is that the way change happens in society is always based on power, right? And power often in the form of resources. And of course, we saw this in the most recent election, that corporations have amazing abilities to access resources and run counter campaigns or run their own campaigns to push back against various kinds of initiatives that I think point toward a better world. And we don't have access to those kinds of resources, but I think we do have access to a different kind of power. And that's the power of many numbers of us coming together and using our own collective energy to fight, right? To push for something else and to build some other alternatives. I think of that as people power. So I'm actually interested in how can we use people power to push back against this kind of top-down power that is very much about how capitalism functions and how this government is structured. So I'm still not completely sure how to respond to that, but those are some of the associations that I have in thinking of balance of power, is that I think we need to shift the balance of power toward us. And that means being real about it and figuring out how to actually get more and more people on our side so that we have that kind of power to make that shift. Does that make sense? Okay.
I just had another question. Do you know if the individual who committed that shooting in Quebec, the terrorist shooting at the Parliament, was he a legal immigrant or was he a Canadian citizen?
He was a Canadian citizen. And so what was fascinating, I was actually in Ottawa in the national capital, and I was in Ottawa getting prepared to catch a bus to get on a plane to start this tour. And there were no buses running. And so I don't know how many of you saw the news about this, because mostly in the US, no one pays attention to Canadian politics. Rightly so, because it's a tiny little place that's very inconsequential. But what happened is this fellow basically shot a soldier at a military monument and then made his way into Parliament, which is basically like the White House, and started preparing to shoot there, and then got into a gunfight with security and was killed. And immediately, the press was full of all kinds of ideas about an Arab man, right, who'd showed up at Parliament. I mean, this is so predictable. It happens, of course, whenever there's any kind of mass violent act like that within the US too, right? This kind of immediate racist hysteria that starts up. Turns out he's a white dude from Quebec who had actually converted to Islam, but had been living in a homeless shelter for the week prior. Like I think like someone who really struggled with mental health and was really living in poverty, and for reasons that no one fully understands, decided to engage in these violent acts. So, I mean, the ruling government still would like to see this as the first blow of like ISIS trying to take on Canada, but it was actually just about this guy. It was just this guy, and he was not. I mean, I took a taxi to the airport, and the Iraqi driver who was driving me said, "I really hope that it's not an Arab," because he had like a deep understanding of what that would mean for Arab communities in Canada if it was an Arab that had committed this violence, right? Like the level of clampdown and violence. And of course, there was actually some that happened, even though it was just this white dude.
So you kind of brought up how we're kind of in this time where racism and sexism and everything's at an all-time height, that it's kind of a dire time. And what is your opinion and thought what is the greatest social disorder that Americans are suffering from, whether it be racism, sexism, white privilege? What is it that we're all been trained and brainwashed?
So I don't think there's one thing, right? Like I think that all these things are happening together at once. And as I was trying to get at, we are affected by them in different ways, right? Based on who we are in the society. So I don't think there's sort of like one thing that's the biggest thing. But part of the way that I've started to think about it is that we need to think about how racism and sexism and these other kinds of isms operate in such a way that they actually are perpetuating a big system. And the way that this system works is that it keeps us very divided from one another and set into these various kinds of social hierarchies that sometimes involve real kinds of violence and harm. But all that works in such a way to make sure that a very few people at the top experience enormous wealth and power and are able to continue to have access to that wealth and power. And so I think there's no easy part to this, right? Because it's about how do we work through those differences and divisions and those very real hierarchies, while also keeping our eyes on the fact that there's some people who are actually invested in this system. They're not just making wrong decisions, they don't just have wrong views, but they are literally and figuratively invested in how this system operates. So this part of the way I think this came out in the Occupy movement, for example, is people talked about the 1% and the 99%, right? Do you all remember this, the kind of slogans of the 1% and 99%? So I love that slogan because I think it helps to say that we have an enemy that's actually benefiting from how things are structured. Now, the problem with that slogan is that we're not all the same in the 99%, right? Like, I am not going to face the same level of police scrutiny and police violence as somebody who's black or brown in the society. That's just a real fact. And we have to talk about those kinds of facts. I'm not susceptible to the same kinds of sexual violence that many women, trans people, and other gender nonconforming people face on a daily basis in this society. So these are real differences in how things work. And so the question is, how do we get real about those while also fighting that 1%? And that's, I think, it's a tough challenge, but that's our challenge, I think.
I have a question as far as the movements that you've come across and the activists that you've come across. Have you met any organization that is fighting against like the feminization of schools and education and getting more men in early childhood education positions?
Trying to get more men into early...
Yeah, like, I mean, I've just been doing some research lately, but it's interesting how significant, like, the amount of teachers in early childhood education positions are women, and how I've been reading up on like how men and women teach differently, and there's pros and cons to both sides, absolutely, because we're all people. But like, is there any push to get like more men into those positions? Because there's a huge amount of children without fathers, and these men are like significant roles in these children's lives, and I'm just wondering if you're coming across any organizations that are even remotely related to that issue.
Okay, so two things about this. One is, I think we partly need to think about this within the overall kind of systemic context, right? Where early childhood education and basically any teaching that is below university level teaching is devalued in the society, right? People are paid shit, and their unions are treated like crap if they have them, and they're just expected to do enormous amounts of work that they don't actually get recognized or paid for. Now, it's not surprising that women often get pushed into those kinds of positions, and that kind of work is seen as women's work. Because women's work in this whole society is devalued regularly, right? There's a ton of work that is often seen as women's work, related to children especially, that is never paid for, that is rarely talked about or even understood as work. So I think part of what has shaped that is this much longer history of what kind of work is associated with what gender. And men's work is often valued much more highly. So the one concrete example that I have encountered that has started to think through some of this is in Detroit, where there's a crew of people, mainly within the Black community in Detroit, who are talking about the fact that there are many single mom households, and that there's a real lack of educational infrastructure in Detroit that's due to long-term underfunding of those institutions. And I can't remember the name of it right now, but I actually have a friend who's recently gotten involved in an initiative that was about trying to bring more men into doing some of that work, both inside schools and outside of schools, to offer some kind of mentorship role within those early education moments. So I thought that was positive. Yeah.
I would like to know what advice you have for us as students or people, moms, dads, brothers, sisters, for interrupting oppressive moments. I think that I see a tendency, I guess I can only speak for myself, to either lash out in just as volatile a way as I hear this, maybe a racist comment, or to be completely quiet. I don't seem to be able to find a middle point that produces anything. I have only tended to become a target or piss somebody off. So what advice do you have for kind of falling in the middle? I mean, we're here to be educated, so we're not here to assume that we all know everything. Obviously, there's room to grow in whatever arena you're in. So what advice do you have for us?
This is actually a question that regularly people are asking wherever I go. And partly that's, I think, about the fact that these kinds of attitudes and oppressive behaviors permeate the society, and people are trying to figure out what to do with them. And again, it's not an easy one to answer. I mean, one thing is about goals, right? Whenever any of this stuff happens, we should think about what are we trying to accomplish in intervening, right? Because sometimes sometimes, honestly, what we're trying to accomplish is to just feel better about ourselves, right? For being like righteous and knowledgeable about how this person is really messed up in what they think. And I'm interested in setting goals that are about how do we move people collectively, right? To actually change their minds and to behave differently. And ultimately, to, in some way, come together and actually challenge the structural circumstances that I think create this stuff. And so then I think it becomes harder because you have to think about, in this moment, what is a strategic kind of intervention to make? And sometimes it can be really useful in an event or like a large-scale setting where you don't have any existing relationship with that person, but they're doing something that's actually really hurting other people who are present. Sometimes it can be helpful to just be like, hey, what you're doing is not all right, and this is why. But often, that's not going to move that person. It might move other people who are present, which is, I think, a worthwhile goal, to try and move other people who are around. But other times, if you have some investment in that person, and you'd actually like to see them change, it can be totally unstrategic to try and call them out in a really public way. It can be much, much better, actually, to pull them aside afterward and have a one-on-one conversation and say, can you tell me more about what you were thinking, like what you were trying to do here? Like, this is why I think what you're saying doesn't work, or is actually like really harmful to other people. So I do think it's about kind of evaluating what the circumstances are and trying to be strategic in that moment. But sometimes you do. You just have to step up and call stuff out. But people talk about this sometimes as calling out culture, right? Where it's like calling out the things that are messed up. And recently, more people have tried to talk about calling in culture, which is how to basically say that's not okay, but in such a way that people might change and might be more willing to like come on to your side in some way. And I do think that there are times when we should try to do more calling in, which I think might help us build. Because sometimes there's a tendency to just fracture, just to basically push people out. And of course, most people have attitudes and ways of behaving that are really harmful to other people. And I think if we do want to build movements, we should think about how to hold on to people even as we try and change them. But of course, some people won't change. So that's the last part, is making an evaluation of like, are people actually changing? If they're not, then maybe it is worthwhile to just say, hey, can you not get in the way? Because there's some people who stick around in activist groups that we really wish wouldn't stick around in activist groups. And I think we should maybe be a little bit more upfront about that. Yeah. I'm saying be strategic and thoughtful about what you're trying to do, rather than just kind of immediately going for the first thing that you feel. It's like, what do we want to accomplish here? But I'm also saying, like, try and bring some respect and generosity into it as well. But at the same time, recognize that, like, can I quote you on that? Yeah, you could. You can quote me on that.
I have a question that might be a little challenging to answer, but I'm curious about just any advice you would have. So as college students who many may be planning to transfer to a four-year university, as I am, and maybe struggling with which major and or minor to choose that will best set you up for tools to enact real change. And I try to recognize that a four-year university is still an institution that oftentimes very much interwoven into the structure. And so I think it's important to look for training and education outside that as well, like not to just rely on the four-year institutional degree, but also recognizing that I can, if I choose wisely, use that as a tool for becoming a better activist and creating change. And I think for me, I've decided on a major in sociology, but I've really grappled with it, gone back and forth a lot. Like, how did you end up choosing the route you did, and what sort of general advice do you have for students grappling with that big question?
Yeah, that is a really good question, and also a really hard one too, because one thing I want to say is that I think sometimes it's easy when we're activists to be tempted to be like, that we have to follow a certain like disciplinary route in the university toward a particular kinds of work that will be fully consistent with our values. But actually, there's really no kind of work that's fully consistent with our values. Like anywhere we end up, there's going to be frustrating ways that we're coming up against these dominant institutions and kinds of systems. And it reminds me of this quote from Noam Chomsky, where sometimes, who's a prominent linguist and social theorist, longtime activist, somebody asked Noam Chomsky, where should we organize? Like, where's the most important place to organize? And he said, just about anywhere. And I really believe that too, right? Of like, so I don't think we have to figure out like how to get ourselves to the most perfect place. Because anywhere we end up, there are going to be opportunities to engage in fights and like build new kinds of visions and alternatives, wherever we end up. So then part of it is about how do we hold on to the values as we take the particular routes that we do. And certainly, university is a place that has lots of possibilities for learning new skills and getting access to like new kinds of training and analysis. And I mean, I took a very, I went to Evergreen in Olympia, Washington, which is a public alternative school. And I went to Evergreen because it had a reputation for being a place where misfits and rabble-rousers go. And I wanted a political education, and I got one at Evergreen. There are other universities like that, where there's just an amazing concentration of people who want to do activist work, and professors who are longtime activists themselves. And so it can be useful to try and find like that. That can be something to pay attention to in terms of where you end up. Are there other people there that you would want to work with, that you could learn from, right? And even in looking at particular disciplines, are there people teaching there that you see as in alignment with your own political values that you could learn from in some way, that you could benefit from being around? University of Oregon used to have a fantastic reputation for being an activist school, although I gather that that's changed somewhat, particularly with the influence of it becoming kind of the Nike university. But I think it's helpful to be thoughtful as you make choices about where you go and think about what will you have access to, and not just at the university, but also wherever it is in the community and what kinds of resources and possibilities for learning and engagement there will be there. But the thing is that you don't have to figure out the perfect thing.
Are you familiar at all with the pattern languages?
With the what?
The use of pattern language?
No.
No?
Say more.
It's essentially a construct wherein folks use an external means for communicating. One really common use is using like a set of cards, where your values or desires or whatnot are set upon them, and you, as a group, use them to reflect and work through confrontation issues or to seek resolution or inspiration, I guess. That'd be effective means for integrating.
Let's give Chris a hand. Thanks for coming.
Thanks to all of you.